Reading from Dreams, Evolution, and Value Fulfillment, Volume 1 by Jane Roberts, A Seth book. Chapter 3. Sleepwalkers, the World in Early Trance, the Awakening of the Species. You have taught yourselves to respond to certain neural patterns and to ignore alternate ones that now simply operate as background activity. That background activity, however, supports a million forces, the neural stimuli that you accept as biologically real. Those other background stimuli are now quite difficult for you to identify, but they are always there in the hinterland of your waking consciousness, like dream chatter, way beneath your usual associations. Neurologically, you tune into only a portion of your body's reality and are ignorant of the great, tiny, but tumultuous communications that are ever flying back and forth in the microscopic but vital cellular world. Electrons, in your terms, are precognitive, and so is your cellular consciousness. Your body's relative permanence in time is dependent upon the electron's magnificent behavior as it deals with probabilities. The cell's stability and its reliability in the bodily environment is dependent upon its innate properties of instant communication and instant decision, for each cell is in communication with all others and is united with all others through fields of consciousness in which each entity of whatever degree plays a part. At one level, your cells obey the rules of time, but on other levels they defy it. All of these communications are a part of the human parcel of reality, and they all exist beneath what you think of as normal consciousness. Events are not built up initially from physical particles. They are the result of psychological activity. In the beginning, you were only aware of that psychological activity. It had not as yet thickened itself into form. The form was there, but it was not manifest. I do not particularly like the analogy, but it is useful. Instead of small particles, you had small units of consciousness, gradually building themselves into large ones, but a smaller unit of consciousness is not less than a larger unit, for each unit of consciousness contains within itself the innate heritage of all that is. You think of the conscious mind as you know it, as the only kind of consciousness with a deliberate intent, aware of itself as itself, and with a capacity for logic and the appreciation of symbolism. That only seems true because of your particular range of activity, and because you can only pinpoint events within a particular psychological spectrum. I call the building blocks of matter CUs, or units of consciousness. They form physical matter as it exists in your understanding and experience. Units of consciousness also form other kinds of matter that you do not perceive. CUs can also operate as particles or as waves. Whichever way they operate, they are aware of their own existences. When CUs operate as particles in your terms, they build up a continuity in time. They take on the characteristics of particularity. They identify themselves by the establishment of specific boundaries. They take certain forms then when they operate as particles, and experience their reality from the center of those forms. They concentrate upon or focus upon their unique specifications. They become, in your terms, individual. When CUs operate as waves, however, they do not set up any boundaries about their own self-awareness, and when operating as waves, CUs can indeed be in more than one place at one time. I understand that this is somewhat difficult material to comprehend. However, In its purest form, a unit of consciousness can be in all places at the same time. It becomes beside the point then to say that when it operates as a wave, a unit of consciousness is precognitive or clairvoyant, since it has the capacity to be in all places and all times simultaneously. Those units of consciousness are the building blocks for the physical material of your body, for the trees and rocks, the oceans, the continents, and the very manifestation of space itself as you understand it. These CUs can operate as separate entities, as identities, or they can flow together in a vast, harmonious wave of activity as a force. Actually, units of consciousness operate in both ways all of the time. No identity once formed is ever annihilated, for its existence is indelibly a part of the entire wave of consciousness to which it belongs. Each particleized unit, however, rides the continual thrust set up by the fields of consciousness, in which wave and particle both belong. Each particleized unit of consciousness contains within it inherently the knowledge of all other such particles, for at other levels again the units are operating as waves. Basically, the units move faster than light, slowing down in your terms to form matter. These units can be considered again as entities or as forces, and they can operate as either. Metaphysically, they can be thought of as the point at which all that is acts to form your world, the immediate contact of a never-ending creative inspiration coming into mental focus, the metamorphosis of certainly divine origin that brings the physical world into existence from the greater reality of divine fact. Scientifically, again, the units can be thought of as building blocks of matter. Ethically, the CUs represent the spectacular foundations of the world in value fulfillment, for each unit of consciousness is related to each other, a part of the other, each participating in the entire gestalt of mortal experience. And we shall see how this applies to your attitudes toward specieshood and man's relationship with other conscious entities and the planet he shares with them. In the beginning, CUs, then, units of consciousness, existing within a divine psychological gestalt, endowed with unimaginable creativity of that sublime identity, began themselves to create, to explore, and to fulfill those innate values by which they were characterized, operating both as waves and particles, directed in part by their own creative restlessness, and directed in part by the unquenchable creativity of all it is. They embarked upon the project that brought time and space and your entire universe into being. They were the first entities then. I want you to try and imagine a situation in which there exists a psychological force that includes within its capabilities the ability to act simultaneously on the most microscopic and the most macroscopic levels, that can form within itself a million separate inviolate unique identities, and that can still operate as a part of those identities and as a larger unit that is their source, in which case it is a wave from which the particles emerge. That description fits our units of consciousness. They build your world from the inside out. As physical creatures, they focused upon what you think of as physical identities, separate, individual differences, endowing each physical consciousness with its own original variations and creative potentials, its own opportunity for completely original experience, and a viewpoint or platform from which to participate in reality. One that at that level could not be experienced in the same way by any other individual. This is the privileged, always new, private and immediate, direct experience of any individual of any species or of any degree, as it encounters the objective universe. At other levels, while each individuality is maintained, it rides the wave-like formations of consciousness. It is everywhere at once, and the units of consciousness that make up your cells know the positions of all other such units, both in time and in space. In the beginning, then, these units operated both as identities or particles and as waves. The main concentration was not yet physical in your terms. What you now think of as the dream state was the waking one, for it was still the recognized form of purposeful activity, creativity, and power. The dream state continues to be a connective between the two realities, and as a species, you literally learn to walk by first being sleepwalkers. You walked in your sleep. You dreamed your languages. You spoke in your dreams and later wrote down the alphabets. And your knowledge and your intellect have always been fired, sharpened, propelled by the great inner reality from which your minds emerged. Physical matter by itself could never produce consciousness. One mind alone could not come into being from chance alone. One thought could not leap from an infinite number of nerve ends if matter itself was not initially alive with consciousness, packed with the intent to be. A man who believes life has little meaning quickly leaves life, and a meaningless existence could never produce life. Nor was the universe created for one species alone, by a God who is simply a supervision of the same species, as willful and destructive as man at his worst. Instead, you have an inner dimension of activity, a vast field of multi-dimensional creativity, a creator that becomes a portion of each of its creations, and yet a creator that is greater than the sum of its parts, a creator that can know itself as a mouse in a field, or as the field, or as the continent upon which the field rests, or as the planet that holds the continent, or as the universe that holds the world, a force that is whole yet divisible, that is one and the inconceivably many, a force that is external and mortal at once, a force that plunges headlong into its own creativity, forming the seasons and experiencing them as well, glorifying in individuation, and yet always aware of the great unity that is within and behind and through all experiences of individuality, a force from which each moment pasts and futures flow out in every conceivable direction. In your terms of time, we will speak of a beginning, and in that beginning it was early man's dreams that allowed him to cope with physical reality. The dream world was his original learning ground. In times of drought, he would dream of the location of water. In times of famine, he would dream of the location of food. That is, his dreaming allowed him to clairvoyantly view the body of land. He would not waste time in the trial and error procedures that you now take for granted. In dreams, his consciousness operated as a wave. In those early times, all species shared their dreams in a way that is now quite unconscious for your kind, so that in dreams, man inquired of the animals also, long before he learned to follow the animal tracks, for example. Where is there food or water? What is the lay of the land? Man explored the planet because his dreams told him that the land was there. People were not nearly as isolated as it now appears, for in their dreams early men communicated their various locations, the symbols of their cultures and understanding, the nature of their arts. All of the inventions that you often think now happen quite by chance, the discovery of anything from the first tool to the importance of fire, or the coming of the Iron Age, or whatever, all of that inventiveness was the result of inspiration and communication of the dream world. Man dreamed his world and then created it, and the units of consciousness first dreamed man and all of the other species that you know. There is a point here that I want to emphasize before we go too far, and it is this. The dream world is not an aimless, non-logical, unintellectual field of activity. It is only that your own perspective closes out much of its vast reality, where the dreaming intellect can put your computers to shame. I am not therefore putting the intellectual capacities in the background, but I am saying that they emerge as you know them because of the dreaming self's uninterrupted use of the full power of the united intellect and intuitions. The intellectual abilities as you know them cannot compare to those greater capacities that are a part of your own inner reality. This inner universe is a gestalt formed by fields of awareized energy that contains what we will call information for now. But we will have some comments later, for this is not the kind of information you are used to. Each unit of consciousness inherently possesses within itself all of the information available to the whole, and its specific nature when it operates as a particle rests upon that great body of inner knowledge. Any one such particle can be where it is, be what it is, and be when it is, only because the positions, relative positions, and situations of all other such particles are known. In the deepest terms again, your physical world is beginning at each point at which these units of consciousness assert themselves to form physical reality. Otherwise, life would not be handed down through the generations. Each unit of consciousness intensifies, magnifies its own intent to be, and you might say, works up from within itself an explosive spark of primal desire that explodes into a process that causes physical materialization. It turns into what I have called an EE unit, an electromagnetic energy unit, in which case it is embarked upon its own kind of physical experience. These EE units also operate as fields, as waves, or as particles, as the units of consciousness do. But in your terms, they are closer to physical orientation. Their die is cast, so to speak. They have already begun the special kind of screening process necessary that will bring about physical form. They begin to deal with all kinds of information that will help form your world. There are literally numberless steps taken before EE units combine in their own fashion to form the most microscopic physical particles. And even here, the greatest, gentlest sorting out process takes place as these units disentangle themselves at certain operational levels from their own greater fields of information, to specialize in the various elements that will allow for the production of atoms and molecules impeccably suited to your kind of world. For again, you have various stages of, say, pseudomatter, of dream images that only gradually in those terms coalesce and become physically viable. For there are endless varieties of matter between the matter that you recognize and the antimatter of physicists' theories. Form exists at many other levels than those you recognize, in other words. Your dream forms are quite as real as your physical ones. They simply fit into their own environment at other levels of activity, and they are quite reminiscent of the kinds of forms that you had in the beginning of your world. While you and all of the other species were what I have called sleepwalkers, your bodies by then were physically capable. In a manner of speaking, you did not know how to use them properly as yet. Now, from a waking state, you do not understand how your dream bodies can seem to fly through the air, defy space and even time, converse with strangers, and so forth. In the same way, however, once, you had to learn to deal with gravity, to deal with space and time, to manipulate in a world of objects, to simply breathe, to digest your food, and to perform all of the biological manipulations that now you take for granted. You could not afford to identify too completely with such bodies until you learned how to survive within them. So in the dream state, the true processes of life began as these new bodies and earth-tuned consciousnesses saw themselves mentally exercising all portions of the body. Behind all that was the brilliant comprehension and cooperation of all of the units of consciousness that go to compose the body, each adding its own information and specific knowledge to the overall bodily organizations, and each involved in the most intricate fields of relationships, for the miracle of the body's efficiency is the result of relationships that exist among all of its parts, connecting it to other levels of existence that do not physically appear. Units of consciousness, CUs, transforming themselves into EE units, electromagnetic energy units, formed the environment and all of its inhabitants in the same process, in what you might call a circular manner, rather than a serial one. And in those terms, of course, there are only various physical manifestations of consciousness, not a planet and its inhabitants, but an entire gestalt of awareized consciousness. In those terms, each physically oriented consciousness sees reality and experience from its own privileged viewpoint, about which it seems all else revolves, even though this may involve a larger generalized field than your own, or a smaller one. So to rocks, say, you can be considered a portion of their environment, while you may consider them merely a portion of your environment. You simply do not tune into the range of rock consciousness. Actually, many other kinds of consciousness, while focused in their own specific ways, are more aware than man is of Earth's unified nature. But man, in following his own ways, also adds to the value fulfillment of other consciousnesses in ways that are quite outside of usual systems of knowledge. If you remember that beneath all, each unit of consciousness is aware of the position of each other unit, and that these units form all physical matter, then perhaps you can intuitively follow what I mean, for whatever knowledge man attains, whatever experience any one person accumulates, whatever arts or sciences you produce, all such information is instantly perceived at other levels of activity by each of the other units of consciousness that compose physical reality, whether those units form the shape of a rock, a raindrop, an apple, a cat, a frog, or a shoe. Manufactured products are also composed of atoms and molecules that ride upon units of consciousness transformed into EE units, and hence into physical elements. What you have, really, is a manifested and an unmanifested consciousness, but only relatively speaking. You do not perceive the consciousness of objects. It is not manifest to you because your range of activities requires boundaries to frame your picture of reality. All of your manufactured objects also originated in the realm of dreams, first obviously being conceived of mentally, and in the same way man produced his first tools. He was born with all of those abilities by which he is now characterized, and with other abilities that in your terms still wait for development. Not that he has not used them so far, but that he has not focused upon them in what you consider the main lines of civilized continuity. Hints of those abilities are always present in the dream state and in the arts, in the religions, and even in the sciences. They appear in politics and business, but as the largely unmanifest intuitive background, which is largely ignored. Man's dreams have always provided him with a sense of impetus, purpose, meaning, and given him the raw material from which to form his civilizations. The true history of the world is the history of man's dreams, for they have been responsible in one way or another for all historic developments. They were responsible for the birth of agriculture as well as industry, the rise and fall of nations, the glory that was Rome and Rome's destruction. Your present technological advances can almost be dated from the invention of the printing press to Edison's inventions, which were flashes of intuition, dream-inspired. But if what I am telling you is true, then it is obvious that when I say that your physical world originated in the world of dreams, I must mean something far different from the usual definition of dream reality. Again, I could choose another term, but I want to emphasize each person's intimate contact with that other reality that does occur in what you think of as the state of dreaming. That analogy will help you at least intuitively understand the existence of situations such as suffering and poverty that otherwise seem to have no adequate explanations. I hope also to account for behavior on the part of nature that certainly seems to imply the survival of the fittest in a tooth-and-claw fashion, or the punishing acts of a vengeful god on the one hand, and the triumph of an evil force on the other. For now, in our tale of beginnings, however, we still have a spasmodic universe that appears and disappears, that gradually, in those terms, manifests for longer periods of time. What you really had in the beginning were images without form, slowly adopting form, blinking on and off, then stabilizing into forms that were as yet not completely physical. These then took on all of the characteristics that you now consider formed physical matter. As all of this occurred, consciousness took on more and more specific orientations, greater organizations at your end. At the other end, it disentangled itself from vaster fields of activity to allow for this specific behavior. All of these units of consciousness, again, operate as entities or particles or as waves or forces. In those terms, consciousness formed the experience of time, and not, of course, the other way around. Alright, it's been 29 minutes. I'm going to end this chapter, but there will be a Chapter 3 Part 2.